I've got to say, I thought she nailed Hermes. Circe says, "You threw me to the crows." That's directly from Greek. This is the most accurate piece of fiction about ancient Greece that I personally have ever read. If I were Athena, I would fully sue Madeline Miller for defamation of character. Hello everyone, my name is Elizabeth. I have a master's in classics from Oxford, and today we are going to be talking about Madeline Miller's Circe. By the way, it's K to K in ancient Greek. Positive and respectful is the vibe today. Sorry if that disappoints you at all. I'm going to do a few disclaimers, but if you do want to skip to the rest of the video, I'll put a timestamp right up here. If you've seen my videos before, you've probably realized that I get a kick out of disliking things that lots of other people tell me they like, and vice versa, which is why my favorite character in the Iliad is Agamemnon. People have been telling me to read this book ever since it came out in 2018. Like, people would come up to me and be like, "Oh, it's a good one," or "Oh, I've read that so many times." So this is going to be a little bit of a hot take. I did not enjoy reading this book. There were a lot of things that I really did like about it, but to be honest with you, it felt like a little bit of a chore every time I picked it up. Like, I'd be like, "Oh, I want to go read some more of Circe," and then I'd start reading it and I was like, "Oh, this is kind of difficult." And I almost DNF'd on it several times, but I knew I wanted to make a review video, so I finished it. All right, before we get into the details, I just want to acknowledge one thing. Being a critic is so much easier than being a writer. Writing fiction is incredibly difficult, and it is especially difficult to write a retelling because you're going to get horrible people like me who are going to get on your case for every single time there was a tiny bit of poetic license taken or it's not historically accurate. Madeline Miller clearly put so much work and time and research and love into this book, and so the more negative portions of this video are not at all to take away from the incredible enjoyment that this book has brought to a lot of readers. I want to start off by talking about my favorite thing about this book. I think that Madeline Miller's Circe, in conjunction with Emily Wilson's Odyssey, she was the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English and be published. These two books together, I think this one came out a year earlier, really did a lot to call attention to and call out this kind of patriarchal and I think problematic way that we often talk about heroes from Greek mythology like Odysseus, Achilles, etc., and to spark some conversations around the fact that Odysseus, for example, has a lot of darkness in him. Like, Odysseus is not this entirely good, heroic man to be celebrated the way he very often is in high school English classrooms, at least in the US. You'll also encounter this kind of sexist viewpoint from like scholarly literature, especially if it's a couple of decades old. Like, there was a point when I was writing my dissertation, when I was like towards the end of it, when I just literally kind of had a breakdown because I was so tired of like, you know, just being completely steeped in this like sexist perspective about Greek marriage like for 8 hours a day. So all of that to say, I feel like these books like did a lot to kind of change people's perspective, and I feel like they're just so necessary. So Madeline Miller is a classicist. She has 2 degrees from Brown, so this is not going to be a how accurate is it video. This is the most accurate piece of fiction about ancient Greece that I personally have ever read. Now, before you at me in the comments, there is also a lot in this book that is made up. Probably 95% of it is made up. And maybe those two statements seem like they're contradictory, but they're not, and here's why. We have so little material from ancient Greece that it is impossible to write a detailed story without making up the vast majority of what's in it. So I'm not going to go through and comment on every little thing and whether or not it's accurate, but if there is anything specific that you want to know whether or not it's made up, leave me a comment below and I will answer it if I can. I'm just going to give a kind of selection, mostly to highlight the places where Miller has really done her research. Hey, Editor Elizabeth here. So this video wound up being way longer than I thought it was going to be, so I actually decided to break it into 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be about the accuracy and the characters and plot, and then in part 2, I'll talk about the quality of the prose, like kind of the sentence level stuff. So the genealogies, like Circe's family, who's related to who, that's all canon. The fact that she, spoiler alert, has a son with Odysseus named Telegonus and that he goes on to found a colony in Italy, that's canon. The moly given to Odysseus by Hermes is canon. The fact that she has nymphs and lions and wolves around is canon. The details in general were super on point, even really subtle choices that she made, like these. So on page 145, she's describing her sister Pasiphae, and she says, "Her skin was bare except for a necklace made of squares of beaten gold. Each one was embossed, a sun, a bee, an axe, the great hulk of Dicte," which is a mountain on Crete. When I visited Heraklion in the museum there was this like golden bee necklace from the Bronze Age, I believe. And nobody really knows 100% what the context of it was, but that's like a real motif from back then. On the previous page, she says, "It was no more than a tool, a sword to hang over his head and make him her slave." That sounds a bit weird, a sword hanging over somebody's head, but we actually had a passage that mentions a sword hanging over somebody's head. It's a man called Damocles that we had to study for my Latin exam. On the next page, Pasiphae says, "She will cry herself into a stone, into some croaking bird." To me, the fact that Miller chose to say stone and croaking bird like isn't a coincidence. It sounds like she's referencing the myths of Niobe and Philomela. She measures time in generations in this book. That feels very accurate to me. Obviously they had other ways of measuring time in ancient Greece as well. I like that when she goes traveling with Telemachus, she acknowledges the presence of other deities from other cultures as well, like not just the Greek ones. On page 89, Circe says, "You threw me to the crows." That's directly from Greek. Basically, the way to tell someone to go to hell in ancient Greek is to say "bales korakas," which literally means throw, presumably yourself, to the crows. So yeah, Miller has just really put the work in to make this book as kind of richly detailed a picture of Bronze Age Greece as she possibly can, and I just really think it's beautiful and admirable. I am gonna nitpick a few things though. Get ready, because it's nitpick o'clock. Apollo shows up on page 228. She says his dark, loose hair was crowned with a wreath. So he definitely wears a wreath and has long hair. Apollo is described as blonde in like 7 different ancient authors. Don't get me wrong, I'm all about diversifying the pantheon and like depicting like less expected ethnicities for the gods, but she doesn't seem to be doing that here, so I'm kind of like, well, why would you not just go with the ancient sources? On page 182, she says, "But of course that was never a real danger. Sons were not punished." Yes they are. You just spent like 3 chapters describing Prometheus's punishment. You think Prometheus isn't a son? You think Kronos and Sisyphus aren't sons? Like, this just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know if maybe she's just talking about like Helios's sons here, but if so, that wasn't clear to me. In the beginning of chapter 16, she says, "Humbling women seems to me a chief pastime of poets, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep." My sister in Christ, go reread the hymn to Demeter. Demeter literally outdoes both of her incredibly powerful brothers by sitting in a temple and doing absolutely nothing. Medea kills her children to get back at her crap husband and then flies away on a chariot completely unpunished. Does she crawl? No. Does she weep? No. Does Electra crawl and weep? No. Also, basically the entire Iliad and the Odyssey is just men crying. Like, they did not have this concept of like men have to like hide their emotions. There were a couple of places where I felt like in a sort of subtle way, the vibe was just a little bit different from what I remember from the Odyssey. Like, for example, on page 326, Penelope is talking to Circe, and Penelope says, "My husband spoke warmly of you, more warmly, I confess, than I liked. He said of all the gods and monsters he had met, you were the only one he would wish to meet again." First of all, Athena, question mark? Second of all, I don't think the Odyssey says anything about Odysseus and Circe having a deep relationship. He's on her island for a year. He's on Calypso's island for like almost a decade. And like, albeit that was not consensual, but it just like didn't really ring true to me, I guess. On the next page, Penelope says, "You should have seen his face when he came home. He killed the suitors, but then what was left? Fish and goats, a graying wife who was no goddess, and a son he could not understand." In my opinion, Miller is really departing from reality here. When Odysseus comes home, which is what she's referencing here, he and Telemachus bond. Penelope is described as still being very beautiful. They go to bed together. They tell each other stories. Odysseus seems very reluctant when he receives this prophecy that he has to go away again eventually and like appease Poseidon, so he's gonna have to leave his family again. This just like doesn't ring true of like what I remember from the Odyssey. I don't think that this sort of thing was in Homer or the original poet's mind like at all when he was writing. Okay, so enough about accuracy. I want to move on to the characters and the plots. Like I said, this book is very feminist and also like very subtly pro-queer in a way that felt really fun and also like authentic to the time period. Like she just casually mentions that Boreas and Apollo are both in love with this young man named Joaquintos, and Hermes like very casually like suggests that Circe should sleep with the nymphs on her island. I've got to say, I thought she nailed Hermes. Like, Hermes is basically my favorite god, and I think that she just did such a good job with him. I love, there's a sentence on page 98 where she says, "Hermes was watching me, his head cocked like a curious bird." I feel like that's just such a great like simile, but also just like, yeah, I thought Hermes' character was very much the way that I personally imagine Hermes. I also loved how kind of having set up Hermes' character as this very like fickle, kind of like playful person who like doesn't really necessarily have a lot of solemnity in his relationships with other people. Towards the end of the book, she kind of contrasts that and says, "One day Hermes will lead me down to the halls of the dead. We will scarcely recognize each other, for I will be white-haired and he will be wrapped in his mystery as leader of souls. The only time he is solemn. I think I will enjoy seeing that." The fact that she calls him leader of souls, that's directly from a Greek word that is often applied to Hermes. You can either say psychopompos, which means sender of souls or like escort of souls. You can also say psychogogos, that's another word that means like same thing, guide of souls. I feel like that aspect of Hermes' personality is like very seldom like completely ignored in like contemporary portrayals of him. So I absolutely love that she is bringing to light the fact that he is actually, the fancy word is chthonian. He's like an underworld god, basically. He's a very prominent underworld figure. On the downside, I've got to say, in all honesty, the only characters in this book that I liked, apart from Hermes, were probably Daedalus and Telemachus. I really didn't like Circe. That's just my personal opinion though. Everybody reacts differently to fictional characters. Personally, I felt like she had very low self-esteem, and I've noticed this when I'm reading other books as well. I just kind of struggle to relate to when a main character has really low self-esteem. Everybody has insecurities, and that is what makes a character relatable, so that's not really what I'm talking about. It's more like when a character like thinks that they're not very attractive, and they like, you know, everybody doesn't like them and they can't do anything right, and everybody is being mean to them all the time, even their own family members. That to me makes it really, really hard for me to like your main character. Like, especially if they kind of like won't shut up about it. Not liking Circe made what I think Miller was trying to make me feel throughout this book, whether it's suspense, romantic tension, rooting for the autonomy and feminism, not work. All of those things kind of fell through for me personally because I didn't feel like I cared about Circe as a character. Consequently, the stakes were kind of lowered for me for that reason. Like, I didn't really care the first time they went past Scylla or Scylla, let alone the third time they went past her. I was kind of like, okay, I'm bored at this point. I don't have a concrete example of this, but I really liked the way that Circe's voice as a narrator like gets a lot more mature like as you go through the book, so you can kind of like watch her growing as a narrator. I'm also glad that she included so much about Circe's life before and after she encounters Odysseus, because I feel like this is something that gets talked about a lot. Like, women in antiquity are very often kind of framed through the lens of like the men whose lives they were a part of, and I feel like that's kind of unfair. So I like that she kind of gives Circe this like larger life that is outside of the context of Odysseus. Trigger warning, and also mega spoiler alert. I thought the choice that Miller made in having Circe be assaulted by a sea captain, or maybe he's a pirate, was a really good one. I think that that kind of helped me to understand later on when Circe's turning everybody into pigs, like kind of why she does that. And I think the metaphor maybe of this sort of like stereotypical thing that I do not agree with, that like men are pigs, is there in antiquity, but I think Miller is kind of like bringing it out in the sort of myth to say like, yes, the reason she's turning these men into pigs is because men can sometimes sort of behave like pigs. Again, I'm not saying that men are pigs, men are not pigs, but I wondered if that was kind of part of what she was doing with the fact that she chose to show Circe being sexually assaulted by someone. I really loved this scene towards the end with Trigon, I guess he's like a, what's that called? A stingray. With Trigon the stingray. I love the way that she describes his eyes as being like cat-like, and the way she describes the like descent down to see him, and the fact that he like kind of has this trick that he's been playing on everybody and that she's able to like kind of see through the trick. Like, that scene was gold in my opinion. I also really loved what Miller did towards the end of this book, where she takes the prophecy about Odysseus's death, which is that his death will come to him while he's on land, but death will come to him from the sea. She takes that, and she takes the fact that Circe and Odysseus have had a son called Telegonus, and that he's going to go and found a colony in Italy, and that Athena is kind of also a part of Odysseus's life, and that she's kind of his guardian, and she like connects up all the dots in a way that actually kind of results in like this plot twist. Towards the end of the book, she threatens her father Helios because she wants to break her exile. So she says that if her father doesn't go and ask Zeus if she can break her exile, she will go and tell Zeus that she spoke to Prometheus when he was being punished and no one was supposed to speak to him. Consequently, Helios gets really angry with her and then winds up granting her wish. I find it really difficult to imagine that Zeus would care about the fact that this little child like spoke to Prometheus. Like, so what? And also, this was like a super long time ago, and like Zeus as a person changes his mind all the time. He just does. So I don't feel like he would like really care about something that he thought was important like several millennia ago. But more than that, like, I don't understand why Helios would feel threatened at all by what Circe is saying. Like, I don't understand why he would feel that Zeus would punish him for something that Circe did. And like, I think Helios kind of like says that at one point, but clearly the reader is supposed to feel that this is a legitimate threat, but like, I just didn't think it was. The thing that really killed it for me with this book is the fact that Circe, not necessarily Madeline Miller, is so hostile towards every single other immortal apart from herself. I get that that's a big theme of the book, especially in view of the fact that, again, spoiler alert, Circe decides to turn herself into a mortal at the end of the book, which is kind of something that she's always wanted. But like, these people were worshipped, they continue to be worshipped. A little critique is one thing, but this was just like too much for me. Like, it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. For example, when Apollo shows up on page 229, Circe says, "I had no time to cry out. It rushed into my throat, battering its way to my belly, as if all the sky were being funneled through me. I gagged, but its swelling force poured on, choking off my breath, drowning me in its alien power. Apollo watched, his face pleasant." Don't get me wrong, Apollo is morally gray, particularly in a contemporary light, as are all of the gods. But it was so intense with like every single one of the gods that I was just like, come on. Or like on page 251, Circe is trying to protect her son from Athena, and she says, "But Athena had no babe, and she never would. Her only love was reason, and that has never been the same as wisdom." Shots fired! Athena is the goddess of wisdom, and Circe's just gonna strip her of that? Girl. Also, I'm sure Miller didn't intend this, but I just wanted to point out that this sentence could kind of be interpreted as like a little disparaging towards women who don't want kids. Circe says, "Athena snapped each word like a dove's neck." Penelope says, talking about Athena, "She is far from the worst of them." Circe says, "Gods are ugly things." So Circe is talking to Athena and she says, "You do not want him," I said. "He killed Odysseus." "Odysseus killed himself," she said. The words hissed through the room like a scythe's blade. "He lost his way. It was you who made him lose it." There's some serious, unsubstantiated allegations going on here today. If I were Athena, I would fully sue Madeline Miller for defamation of character. As far as I personally know and can remember, having taken multiple courses on Homer, there is nothing in the epic cycle where Athena causes Odysseus to lose his way, or even anything that references Odysseus losing his way. Again, that's mostly from memory, I could be wrong, but it's not ringing any bells for me. So yeah, just the way that the gods were treated in this book just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. I also make comics over on my Instagram and TikTok, so you can check me out over there if you would like to. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video.